prayer here in just a minute.
Okay.
Let's see, I know I we'll get you on the next one.
Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters, with absolute purity. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, they should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. The widow who is really in need, left all alone, puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead, even while she lives. Give the people an instruction so that no one may open a blame. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially their own household, is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60. Has been faithful to her husband and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up her children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. As for younger widows, do not put them in such a list, for when the sensual desires overcome the dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle, going from house to house, and not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have in fact already turned away to follow Satan. Any woman who is a believer has widows in her case, she should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need.
Okay, all right. So we look at this section now. He's talking primarily about widows, but I want us to focus on this first verse here. So he has some relationships that are important as it relates to every person in the congregation. And so what was his expectation toward older people, to older men, for more specifically?
Not to rebuke.
Okay, yeah, and it's interesting, he says do not rebuke, and it seems like the don't rebuke but encourage actually applies to all of them. But it's how each of them are supposed to be done. Did you notice the organization, at least in the ESV, it says do not rebuke an older man but encourage him as you would a father. And then it's like, connected off of that, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. So it seems like you've got this connection of how you interact. So when you think about the relationships within a local church, obviously each of them are different, but I think there's a point here about how we confront, disagreements and mistakes and areas of growth. And so what do you think is the principle there? You come in with a 2x4 and you knock everybody out, right? That's
Treat everybody like family and with respect.
right. Is it? Yeah. So there's a couple of elements there, would you do this to your dad? Would you walk up to your dad and be like, Dad, that was totally uncalled for, right in the middle of everything? You wouldn't, especially in that culture where, our culture may not have that same kind of honor, shame kind of element to it. You just wouldn't do that. Go ahead.
Well, I think we can, in those situations, we can often just spin our wheels on how exactly do we do this? What is the exact perfectly right way to go about this? I think it just really gives a nice principle there. It's like, if I'm thinking about somebody older than me that I believe is in error, or that I have to treat them like I would my father in that situation.
Right.
And I'm going to just handle that a very different way, but it also necessitates that you have that relationship with that person.
Sure.
I think it goes kind of to what we talked about in the Fall Focus this past week, is you have to grow a relationship with people to actually be able to encourage them as a father.
Yeah. It's not like rebuke him like a stranger, right? It's not just like someone you run out, you just see out in the road. It's someone that you have a family relationship with. And that's really the background of so much of the New Testament, is not to just say, hey, we come and worship together. It's to say, this is the family of God now. This is your true family, more than even the physical family that you have. And you see that with all of these descriptions. And what another element of this, and this goes to what Austin was saying, is that a lot of times the relationship and the way we talk about and the way we handle our relationships with other people, particularly in the local church, is actually rooted in lessons we should learn already in the family. So a lot of times you have like how a husband and wife interact, or how a father and child interacts, or that kind of relationship, and then how that, like, you've learned something in that relationship over the years, and now you need to take that and keep that same element as you come through and you talk about that in the local church. So the way that we would talk to our father is going to be different. The way that we talk to a younger man as a brother is going to be different. The way we talk to an older woman as a mother is going to be different. A younger woman as a sister, obviously with all purity, he's going to talk about that, about fleeing these kinds of things. I think we already talked about that a little bit back in chapter 4. I may be thinking, about the things to pursue back in chapter 4, but you'll have it also in 2 Timothy. But you have a relational dynamic in all of these kinds of things. And so what other applications do you see? What other principles do you think apply here?
Well,
Go ahead.
That's not what I really had in mind, Shane. I want to know, when do you consider the older man, is it somebody just a year older than you? Or,
I don't know. It says older, so
Yeah.
I mean, so I don't know. It's one of those things. It's like with preaching. You never say someone's old. You just say older, right? Younger. So I don't know, but I think we all kind of have someone in our mind, right, that we look at and we have respect for. But I guess in your case, Pete, most of the people are going to be younger, so you can go for them as brothers. So
well, it's a matter of respect.
Sure.
You know, they're experienced people, and so you have to respect their experience.
sure.
Yeah.
And I love the point we're making here about it's a family, right? And it's within that kind of concept that I think the next section really makes sense, is that just think about what in your family right now, what would happen if, like in my case, what if my dad passed away? Or maybe in Austin, Wes, other people, what if my dad passed away? What would be the relationship that I would need to have with my mom now? What would be the obligations that would come out of that? Because that's going to be now the situation he talks about is regarding widows. So if I'm around in that case, what do I need to do?
Take care of it.
Yeah. In my case, I'm an only child, so I have some unique obligations toward both my parents, right? I can't go through and say, hey, brother, sister, whatever. But he makes that point in verse 4, if she has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness in their own household and make some return for their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. So if this is seemingly talking about people that are Christians, but also just in general, if someone's claiming to be a follower of God, they need to go through and practice that first off in their own household. You notice that? Get your own act together. Take care of that situation first. And I like this statement here. It says to make some return to the parents. But I like what yours said. What does yours say in verse 4 about what they're doing back? I think it's something like paying back the parents.
Caring for their own family, and so repaying their parents and grandparents.
Yeah. So it's the concept of you're making deposits, right? You're making deposits with your children, you're investing in them, and then as you get older, they're paying you back, in a sense, for what they've done. And I don't think that's necessarily just like, putting your thumb on them or anything, but it was interesting. I was talking with my neighbor about this, and so it's funny. I don't know what his portfolio looks like or his investments or anything. I don't get the impression he's just, just some wealthy, kind of the millionaire next door kind of situation. But what's interesting when I've talked with him is he said that he invested in the Lord's retirement program. And he has 10 kids. That's what, we think, whoa, first off, that's a lot of kids, right? And it is. But look at what he's saying here. In a sense, that is the Lord's retirement program, is that you are going through and putting into them, and they're going to take care of you when you get older. Now, am I saying you can't invest and you can't go through and do all these things to take care of yourself? No, I'm not saying that. But there's something to be said about this relationship. So, what do y'all have to say about it? Agree? Disagree? Have y'all thought about it that way?
Well, nowadays, we just put them in a nursing home.
Yeah, which that's not good at all. And we think of, and maybe this is the American dream, hyper-individualism, is that I've got to work for a certain amount of time. I've got to build up a big enough nest egg to where I take care of myself, right? Guys, that's hyper-individualism. That's not really the concept. Yes, you need to be responsible, but none of us lives to ourselves or dies to ourselves, is what Romans 14 points out. Go ahead.
I think it's definitely multifactorial, but to your point about American individualism, I mean, we get to this point where we're not poor in spirit, but we're middle class in spirit. We're pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and I don't depend on anyone. I shouldn't have to depend on anyone, and I can do it by myself. When you start developing that type of religion, that seeps into every other part. You don't rely on grace enough. You don't appreciate what the Lord's done for you that you cannot repay. So I think that, for my grandmother, actually, she wanted to go to assisted living. She's like, I don't want to be a burden on them. And we fought her and fought her and fought her. I think the point there is, I understand her sentiment, but she's always done for herself. And she doesn't want to be a burden. And I think that there's systemically a problem there.
Sure.
We've created a culture that says, I don't need to be burdened by my older parents. I don't need to be burdened by my grandfather, my grandmother.
Yeah, that it is a burden.
I need to live my own life. If you can't be burdened by that, then, how are you going to bear one another's burdens when it comes to sin?
Yeah.
So it's just this, microcosm of physical family into a bigger spiritual family issue.
Yeah, it's like being a burden is like, the unforgivable sin. You can't do that. And yet there's something to be said about the way God has made it is, yes, it's a burden, but it's at a particular point in life where you can bear the burden. You can help. And, it's one of those, I've got a friend of mine, he had said this to me years ago, but he said, never deny anyone an opportunity to serve. And there was a reason for that, is because through service, you actually are learning to be more like Christ. You're learning your responsibilities toward one another. And again, I'm not saying you don't want to try to take care of yourself, but it's through the caring of our parents that we actually grow closer to them. We love them. We appreciate them. At least it should be that way. Because I don't know how y'all felt about it. And some of y'all have kids. I mean, you'll maybe eventually see all that kind of concept. But when I think about all the diapers that my parents changed and all the things that they put up with, I really love them more. I appreciate them more. And it's because I'm having to bear a burden now. And if I never had the burden in the first place, I wouldn't have appreciated that. And so I think when you look at what he's saying here, there's something about that. He said it in verse 4, let them first learn to show godliness in their own household. Learn it. Learn it through what? A burden. It is a burden to take care of the mother, the grandmother. But it is a way that you learn to show godliness. You learn to show that reverence for God. And what is the responsibility? And when that's done, you'll notice in verse 4, it's not that God's just got this, oh, well, you know what, here's another lazy person, didn't take care of their retirement. No, there's a pleasing element to the Lord where family is willing to take care of family there. And again, we're not excusing laziness, we're not excusing all those kind of things. But poverty is a complicated thing. As we talked about, it seems like 10 years ago, but that was earlier this year. It's a complicated thing. And we need to kind of think about that. Other thoughts on that before we move into what the church does? Go ahead.
Well, Shane, on a side note, that person that you were talking about that had 10 kids, I'm sure he had more invested in his 10 kids than he would have in an insurance policy or an IRA. Right.
And they're a whole lot more invested in his health and caring for him than an insurance company is.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We're unprecedented in society right now to where we have a level of wealth where it's expected that you take care of yourself when you can't work anymore. And so I think the one thing we have to take away from this is just because it is so uncommon in our churches for the church to be taking care of a widow, there's going to be some level of idea around it that they must have done something wrong to not be in a position where or really they should be finding a way to support them, or really somebody else should be taking care of them. When, the idea of, for instance, say if we had enough widows, it'd be perfectly scriptural for us to build somewhere for them to live,
right,
and pay staff to take care of them.
Sure.
And these are very biblical concepts for that are just really foreign to us because we've never had to do it in the way our society is.
Sure.
So when those situations arise, we have to recognize that it's kind of like paid elders. You know, it's like we just don't do it, so it must be wrong.
Right,
You know, well,
right.
it's a very scriptural thing that we need to remember has a very scriptural precedent.
Well, and both of those have very intentional reasons for it, is to understand the value of age, the care for, and the community element that we have in the local church, even with the paying of elders, realizing their work is so important that we want them to pour into that and to devote the time to it. It's more important than the work that we do in all kinds of other education or businesses and that kind of thing. And just to realize it, not that the others aren't important, but that there are some things that are more important. And it's just because of value, in the sense of some things are temporary and some things are eternal. And the things that they're dealing with are things that are eternal. And so we need to keep those concepts in mind. So let's talk about the local church here. So he mentions in verse 5 about the widows. So this is one that is left alone, and she has set her hope on God. Okay? So think about, I mean, she has nothing. And the only hope she really has is God. And she continues in supplications and prayers night and day. Okay, so this is a woman that is just completely dedicated to God. I think about the widow in Luke 2. I forgot to look up her name. Anybody remember the widow in Luke 2? I was saying it was going to come to me, but I didn't spend enough time thinking about it. Oh, where are you? Anna, that's who it was. Took me a while. Okay, so I think about her. She was devoted, staying in the temple, telling people about God as much as she could. So this is the kind of person in the scripture. Then in verse 6, you've got someone who is self-indulgent. So she's not concerned about other people. She's not concerned about the Lord. She's just concerned about herself. And what does he say about her in verse 6? What's her relationship to life in general? Do you notice? It says that she is dead even while she lives. Okay, so you got two contrasts here of somebody that's alive and someone that's dead. All right, so then you've got a command about it. So these people, these specific type of widows, they need to be without reproach. Okay? And if anyone, again, I'm sorry, this is for the church in general, so that they will be above reproach. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for the members of his own household, he is denying the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Okay, so that's going back to our discussion we already had, and then we'll talk about widows here in just a second. So why do you think he says this? Why is he so firm about this relationship of taking care of family? You notice there at verse 8, where he says that they've denied the faith and they're worse than an unbeliever.
It doesn't seem very charitable to have your family members having to be on the dole because you're not doing what you need to take care of them. Not very becoming of a Christian.
Yeah, it's like in 2 Thessalonians 3, kind of, I'm not really working, just kind of making my way around. And he's like, no, if you're not going to work, you're not going to eat.
Jesus condemns the Pharisees for giving to God and not taking care of their parents. So, there's two sides of the coin. You can completely forsake them and go pursue worldly things. Or you can try to say, I'm giving all this to God, and they need to take care of themselves.
Yeah.
And also, if you're not going to take care of your own family, how will you take care and watch over the alien among you?
Oh, yeah.
That is another biblical principle. So.
Well, and I mean, some of the worst people in the world, they take care of their family. I mean, you can look at people like in the mafia. What do? They'll take care of the family. The family is king. That kind of concept, right? And like if you have people that have completely denied the faith and are unbelievers, good grief, they at least understand this principle. And so that's because they're kind of a distorted image of God. Like they've distorted some of the principles that God has laid out. The love for the family has now become an idol. But let's talk about the widow here. So he elaborates on the widow that can be taken care of. She is not less than 60 years of age, having been the husband of one wife, a reputation for all these kinds of good works. So let's talk about that. Why 60 years old? 60 in our culture is kind of young, relatively. For them, it would have been a little bit older. One passage that I didn't even realize, did you know that the men of war for Israel could only be from 20 to 60? So back in Leviticus chapter 27, verses 3 and 7, he points that out, that there's a way that, of course, I think there's men of war was going to be even younger than that, but there's a way that I believe it's taxation or the way the offerings, there was a way that it changed at 60. And so for the Jewish concept, if you were approaching 60, you are now in older age. So the relationship is going to change. But let's talk about some of these qualities. So she has a reputation for good works. She's brought up children, shown hospitality, washed the feet of the saint, cared for the afflicted, devoted herself to every good work. So, I mean, how would you describe this lady that has fallen into a category like this? She's just a slacker, right?
Set her hope on God.
Yeah, she has set her hope on God, hasn't she? She has really understood the gospel and is living it out the way that she's supposed to. She's an example for the local church. Go ahead.
It's kind of like the parent who's done all this time investing in their children, gets taken care of by their children. She's spent her life investing in the church and in the gospel, and so the gospel is going to take care of her.
Yeah.
But one other just thought with that, the fact that she's supposed to be have been a one-man woman, or
Sure.
that it would be ludicrous to say that this means that a woman who's been widowed twice couldn't be enrolled. And it's the exact same phrase that's used back about elders, about
Sure.
about their marital status, just reversed in gender. So I think there's a level of precedent there for what that means.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of their character, not you've had 2 husbands die, so we're not going to take care of you.
Right. Right. Yeah. Let's chat through a couple of those things. So let's understand her character. But this one, I think, actually helps us in some of the qualifications for elders. Okay, and we can talk through that a little bit. First off, let's talk about the children for a second. If she has brought up children, so she can only be put on the list if she's had 2 or more. I think we understand that having 1 in this case is qualifying her for being put in that situation, right? She's raised children, it's offspring. And that's how these words are used, and it has to be contextually defined, right? So, do you have a comment? Okay. I thought I saw your hand go up.
I just think it's kind of, she could still be a widow without having children.
Do what?
She could still be a widow without having children. And
Oh,
she
that's
still could
true.
do the majority of these things without having children. There's just something to think about.
Sure. Yeah, and so then going to Austin's point here, we get kind of wrapped around the axle. What does husband of one wife mean? What does wife of one husband? This is in a past tense of it, but still it's talking about the attribute just in the reverse. And if he was saying that this person can never have been remarried, like if a spouse had died or something like that, just think about what Paul is saying here in verse 14. About the younger. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. Realize if they had actually followed Paul's instruction and remarried, they would then not be able to be put on the list later if that spouse died again. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, guys. We've got to realize that there is an attribute that is being talked about. She didn't run around on her husband. She was faithful. She didn't put him away. In some unscriptural divorce or something, and now her husband's passed away. Like there's a condition, a quality that has been laid out in this lady that has now shown that she can be supported by the church. Questions, comments? Thoughts about that? Disagreements. We'll take disagreements, so. Go ahead.
I don't know if I should even start talking about all this, but I think you just have to be careful. You know, I think that
Sure.
if I was considered for an elder 30 years from now, and I had 2 believing children and 1 unbelieving child,
Sure.
that would be a call for myself. You know, like, can I really go with that? If this widow was saying, you know, I've never had any children, but my character exhibits the rest of these things, and people agreed with that. But she just felt like, you know, I don't know if I should take money for the church because it says this. Maybe that means we personally take money up and not from the church. I mean,
Sure.
there's ways that we can be saved and stay within the bound of the scripture and still fulfill these commands. I just think it behooves us to be careful when we take liberties in these areas, but also not to take conservative approaches that aren't in the scripture.
Yeah, so sometimes there's plenty of workarounds. This is about a permanent support by the church, and that's what we're going to see. We see it there in verse 9, that, or I'm sorry, not verse 9, but it's where she's being added to the roll, or she's added to the list. I think that's an Acts 6 situation, where this is a list of widows that are supposed to be taken care of in the daily distribution, okay? That's the same kind of concept. And maybe these are special servants in the church as well. They are proven, and they're taken care of by the church. And so there's those kind of elements. But what you pointed out, I think, is a critical thing, and we need to understand this in local churches as regarding issues. There are situations where based on my conscience or my comfort level, I'm not going to do something, okay? Based off of how I understand husband of one wife to be, how I understand the children, believing, faithful, all of those kinds of things. That's perfectly fine and needs to be appreciated. The concern is when we go through as a church and we make laws, are we making our interpretation as the standard that everybody's got to come to. That's the issue. And so you have to be careful about that on both sides. So, we can't be too loose with it, but we also can't be too restrictive. And we've got to just say what the Scripture says and try to wrestle through it. And a lot of this, it really is hard. I mean, you look at it and you're like, well, he just didn't talk about it. And it's not like you can go to another passage in another context where it's like, hey, here's exactly what it meant. Like on a marriage, divorce, or remarriage situation where you're like, well, I don't know exactly what he meant here. Well, you turn to another text, there it is. There's the answer, that the picture is there that explains the other situation. So I think as it relates to this, though, and I think it even plays into 1 Timothy 5, is God is wanting us to use our sound judgment. God's not going through and saying, hey, you bunch of silly people that can't make decisions and aren't very smart. No, look at the situation. Has this person, in this case, shown the proven qualities? He's not giving an extensive list of everything. He's trying to look and kind of give a snapshot of who this person is. I'm thinking it applies a lot to the qualifications for elders, too. But thoughts, disagreements, what do y'all think about that?
The question it raises in my mind is how perfectly, literally, and checklist-like can we take this? Because what widow is most likely to need this kind of help? A barren one who
Right.
doesn't have children to take care of
Sure.
her. So, I mean, does this really apply to, oh, well, you were barren.
Yeah.
You didn't. So you haven't raised children, but you've done everything else. I personally think that is ridiculous.
Well-
That surely couldn't be the meaning of this when this woman has in her own way raised children. If she's washed the feet of the saints, been hospitable, she's devoted herself to every good work and is, committed to serving this church.
Well, it's even beyond the list. She apparently doesn't have anybody. That's the
Yeah.
whole point. So is he pointing out this is a checklist, or is he trying to identify these attributes in the people themselves? So, and I think what it comes down to is we have to just then say, all right, we understand what the scriptural principles are. Let's take the principles and make the best decision in the moment, and try to go through that. Unless we think that we don't have this situation in our local churches, just think about it. We have widows that are in our church right now. And we need to be asking the question, are we taking care of them the way that we're supposed to? Do they have children? Do they have grandchildren? And these, again, the ones that are enrolled, I understand to be in a permanent, they're always, it's like they just kind of get it cut, whether it's a check or a daily distribution of food or whatever. That's something that's going to be going on. But this isn't talking about one-time need or even a semi-permanent need. This is something that this person is being taken into the role, and that kind of concept.
And to your point, so much so that they would be condemned if they forsook their commitment to the church in that way and got remarried. Like this is they are, it seems in the context that they are committing themselves to the work of the church and will not go get remarried.
Yeah, so that is interesting, because in verse 11, he says, don't refuse the younger, because their passions will draw them away from Christ, desire to marry, and incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith or former pledge. So there is a bit of, what's he talking about? Is he talking about people that have actually left the Lord because now they're wanting to be remarried? Or is he saying they made a commitment to the church and then now they're not keeping their commitment? I'm in the camp that I think they've fallen away from the Lord, but there is something to be said. Like, this is a stringent quality. Like, it's not just kind of handing out to whoever. So as we look at these women as well, besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house. Not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. Imagine how a church could enable that if you've got a younger widow that's not as dedicated to the Lord as she needs to be, and now she's on the church payroll and she doesn't have to work. What is she going to do with her time? I mean, hopefully she serves the needs of the saints, but it's also possible if she's not being faithful, she could just go run around and cause all kinds of trouble. And so he points out in 14, have them marry, bear children, manage their households, so that the adversary has no occasion for slander, which apparently that could have happened if they had followed in that example. But I want us to talk here about verse 16 a little bit. I thought we would make more progress, so we may not make it all the way to the end of verse 5, or chapter 5. But 16, this is a critical text as it regards the responsibilities of the local church versus the responsibilities of the individual. For me, when I've gone through and studied the topics of institutionalism, this has been one of the passages that whenever you hear someone say, whatever the individual can do, the church can do, I mean, this passage just rings in my head. That is not the case. And so now that we've gone through and seen the strict qualities for the church to take on permanent support, read again with me verse 16. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Okay? So if you're a believer, or if she's a believer and she has, if this woman is a believer and she has some widows that she can take care of, she needs to be taking care of those people. And then let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. So the main point in all of that discussion, and it is important for our time, is what can the church be involved in? Can the church be involved in all kinds of aid to all kinds of people on an ongoing basis? Or is the church limited in scope to take care of believers on an as-needed basis? And then, obviously, as we talk about here in chapter 5, there's a specific quality for permanent support. So what do y'all think about that? Have y'all noticed that verse, been aware of that verse? Thoughts, disagreements? You can kind of play through whatever you think on it.
I've heard that concept, but I've never equivalated this verse to that concept. So it's helpful to have an example that says, hey, this is something that individuals need to take care of, church doesn't.
Yeah, so there's two texts that if you go back and you look at debate books and all that kind of stuff on that kind of thing, two passages that are really important to understand the difference between the church and the individual. This is one of them, 1 Timothy 5:16. The other one is Matthew 18, where he talks about if your brother sins against you, you go to him individually, then you go and take 2 or 3, and then you go and grab the whole church. That's a difference between what I do as an individual and what I do as a local church. Now, this one particularly was about care of widows, which during that time was a really big deal, because they're arguing widow homes, orphans' homes, are these things that the local church is supposed to be involved in. We know they're all good things. Everybody agreed that they were good things. It was a matter of, are these could build, maintain, and then be taking care of widows in the community. It's not just to take care of, we bought a house over here and we're having our widows taken care of. That's not the situation that was being discussed. It was about general aid out in the community. Go ahead.
Yeah, James 1:26 and 27 is also another one that points out the difference between the individual and church action.
Sure. Well, and if you look at it carefully, every single one of them does. Every passage that is appealed to, whether it's a Galatians 6 and verse 10, James 1:27, or 2 Corinthians 9:13 at the end about the spreading. Every one of those talks about a unique difference between what is out there in the world and what we have as saints. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 is all about the offering for the saints. Galatians 6 makes that point. Do good to all, especially to the household of believers. But he's not talking just generally about what the church uses their funds for. He's talking about the responsibility of individuals. Same way in James 1. Other thoughts, questions? Of course, there's a whole another discussion about the organization of elders being over other organizations and taking care of things that are not the flock. So you have those kind of concepts as well. But it's about what can the Lord's money be used on, and what's the responsibility of the local church, and what are the leadership supposed to be over. But that being said, though, we can't swing the other way and say, hey, we don't care about widows, right? This whole text was to say the church takes care of them. It just needs to be in specific areas. And so we just have to be careful with it and just follow the Lord's wisdom. The Lord knows how these things should be done and that concept. All right, now we talked about this a little bit. I want us to talk here about the relationship with elders. We've got just a couple minutes. We'll pick up this more next time, but let me read here verse 17 down through verse 21. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the Scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages. Do not admit a charge against an elder, except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. As for those who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all, so that the rest may stand in fear in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus and of the elect angels. I charge you to keep these rules without prejudging, doing nothing from partiality. All right, so I think we've already established, we've talked about this, about churches supporting elders. It seems like something that I've talked about recently. But it's interesting in verse 18, what was his appeal as authority for doing that? Go ahead.
The same that he uses in 1 Corinthians 9 to talk about he and Barnabas and Peter and others being worthy of support.
Yeah, and interestingly to me, it's the Old Testament, right? He references the Old Testament, and then he looks out at society. Now, I don't think he's saying that, he's not looking at the Old Testament saying, hey, we're under the 10 Commandments. He's not saying all of those concepts, but what he is pointing to is there's wisdom, there's precedent here, that if you work, you receive the benefits of your labor. These men are working, and therefore they need to receive the benefit of it. So, we have that precedent made for elders, and then he mentions about a charge here against an elder. And now this seems really simple, right? It's got to be 2 or 3 witnesses. And if you look, that was the principle in the Old Testament. It's the principle that Jesus made in Matthew 18. You just don't flippantly just take accusations against people. But yet, when you think about complaints that come against elders, how often is it just one person? It's just this one guy that, he's got some issue, and he said, I saw the elder doing this. There's no witnesses of this. Maybe he went and said, hey, I saw this, and he grabbed some other people to kind of levy his accusation. But that's not what he said. He said they have to be witnesses, 2 or 3, that had actually seen him do whatever the case is. And the assumption is they've already done Matthew 18, right? They've got to go through, I mean, Matthew 18 isn't thrown out as a result of this. They've still got to do this. So they've come now, 2 or 3 witnesses have brought the accusation against the elder. He's aware of it. Timothy's now aware of it. And what is he supposed to do in verse 20?
Should rebuke them now.
Yeah, exactly. It's sweep it under the rug because he's been a good guy for so many years, right? That's not what it is. It's you've got to hold him accountable in the presence of all so that the rest may fear. This is church discipline. And when we kind of say, hey, we shouldn't talk about sin, we shouldn't address sin in each other's lives, look, that's not part of how this community works. This community is founded in the truth. And if we can point to the truth and say, you have done something wrong, we're helping each other to hold each other accountable, and that we're ultimately growing closer to God as a result of it. And I'll tell you what, when I think about this text, wow, you'd be afraid of talking to, so-and-so that's been an elder for however long. There's people that are like, I've been an elder 20 years. I've been an elder 30 years. Who are you, you young whippersnapper, right? But then, so you're afraid of them, right? But look at what he says here in 21. All right, in the presence of God and of Christ and the elect angels, I charge you to do this without prejudging and doing nothing from partiality. You don't be afraid of him. You be afraid of whose presence you are truly in, and you be very, very careful about how you go about this process. Don't just assume it. Make sure that this is actually the case, and don't be partial about it. It doesn't matter if he's been an elder 50 years. It doesn't matter if he can perform miracles or whatever. It doesn't matter. If he is staying in sin, rebuke him in the presence of everybody. I'll tell you what, there's a lot of churches that I wish they would have gone through that process, because a lot of times there's elders that just destroy churches that are sinning and they need to be rebuked in the presence of all, and yet we have situations where people fall down on that. And that's hard. And I'm not saying I'm perfect in that, but there's a reason for it. Go ahead.
It also goes the other way. There are factions in churches.
Sure.
And the faction can get crazy. And to me, I'd always thought this is interesting, because what he's telling Timothy, this is hard. You have to do it, so don't lay hands on anyone too hastily.
Exactly.
And sharing their responsibility for their sins or others. So that can be either defending the elder when he is sinning, or defending those who are causing trouble.
Sure.
And keep yourself free from sin. And then, Timothy, don't drink water exclusively, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent ailments. Anyone who's ever been in a position of responsibility in trying to do the right thing knows how stressful that can be.
It's that ulcer kind of stuff. All right, we'll stop right there. I've gone a few minutes over. We'll talk about the rest of that next week, and we're going to finish the book. So whether it's one way or another, we may have to kind of run over it. So thank y'all for your good comments.
Hallelujah.